All right, so we should be live, and don't see any viewers just yet, but maybe they'll start trickling in. I'd like people to let me know if they can hear me and see me. We may have some slight technical difficulties because I am broadcasting from Uruguay. I'm not at home, and so I don't have my microphone or any stuff like that. I'm also not in the best lit room, but you know, it's my hotel. What can you do? So if anyone can hear me, please say so in the chat. And if you cannot hear me, okay, great. So everyone can hear and see me. All right, so let's get started. This is Sam Shankland, the newly crowned U.S. champion, and I'm here to talk a bit with the folks here at iChess about my run at the U.S. Championship, how I won, and showing some of my games, and also to plug my video series, which I'm going to put a link. It should be in the video description, but I'm also going to type it into the chat here, just because I think it will be useful for everyone to have. And this has basically all of my stuff, 46 hours of chess instruction for only 99 bucks. And you can use that to buy the series. I'll plug it again later. In any case, let me just talk a little bit about the U.S. Championship. So I won the tournament with a score of +6. So I made 8.5 out of 11. It was an absolute dream come true for me. And I won a nice prize check and the biggest result of my life. So a lot of these wins came with black. And the first one we're going to look at is my second win. This one was against my Olympic teammate, Ray Robson. So I'm just going to share the screen with my chessboard. So can everybody see my chessboard screen now? Hopefully that's what people can see and not not my face anymore. So if people can see my chessboard, please let me know. Seeing a question, what's my rating? I am rated 27 something, 2717. So can everyone see the chessboard? Should have a standard open Roy position open that I'm now moving back from. So at this point, it should be opening position. Can everybody see that? There. I'm not good at this whole. Okay, sorry for any technical difficulties, but I'm not good at this whole stuff. So we're going to start with round 4. So as a prelude to this, in my first 3 games, I had made 2 out of 3. I had beaten Azoria in round 3 after making draws in rounds 1 and 2, and I had beaten Azoria with black. So here I was playing black for the second game in a row. And this one was against, as I said, my Olympic teammate, Ray Robson. Now, going into this game, I was feeling a little under the weather, and I had already won a game, and I thought I'm playing black, which is not great, so I would like to sort of consolidate my +1 score, see if I can hold a draw, and then look forward to playing white the next day after making 1.5 for 2 with 2 blacks. So in any case, Ray is a diehard E4 player, best by test. That's just his way of going. So he played E4 against me, which he does basically every game. I don't know why I can't see the chat. So E4, and then it went E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop B5. So this is the start of the Roy Lopez. Now, I've mostly been a Sicilian player in the past, but you know, the older you get, when you become an old man like me at 26, you start to find time for lines like the Spanish. But I chose not to play one of the more typical Spanish with, like, say, bishop e7 as the main move here, which could be the prelude to any of the Zaitsev, the Breyer, the Chigorin, which are sort of the core 3 key Spanish lines, and or it could even be the Marshall. But I chose a more direct move with knight takes e4. So this is the open Roy Lopez, which was pretty popular maybe 3 to 4 years ago, but then somehow completely disappeared from top play. I never really understood why, because I thought black was always equalizing, but there's certainly a lot of variations for him to memorize. So white starts with the move d4 to open the center. Excuse me. So the point is that if black were to take this pawn, that there's going to be a lot of pins which get nasty with rook e1. So this knight on d4 is pinned to the king, as we can see. And if black were to defend with d5 after knight takes d4, now this knight is pinned to the king and attacked again, and f3 is coming, and this is a very difficult position. So after d4, I can't take the pawn, and I played b5, bishop b3, and now d5. So I'm giving the pawn back on e5, and after bishop e6, we have a very interesting position where I think black is fine, but he's under a little bit of pressure in a lot of these variations. It's funny, both the c6 knight and f3 knight are kind of in the way, because black wants to set his pawn majority in motion by playing c7 to c5, while white would like to play f2 to f4. So both of these knights are sort of in the way, and it's quite an interesting line. So without further ado, we're going to go forward a bit. So Ray played c3, which is fine. It's a totally normal move. Bishop e7. But here he surprised me with the move bishop f4, which I had not actually seen. But then when I checked later, it was in my file, but it wasn't covered very deeply. And I actually think it's one of the best tries to fight for an advantage. The point of bishop f4. Actually, I'm going to stop here. Let's see if anybody can figure out what white's point is when he plays bishop f4. You can type it in the chat. Anyone who says I'm not old, you don't know what 26 means when you're a chess player. I have gray hairs coming out of my eyebrows, and I'm older than the median age of the U.S. Championship. So I'm an ancient being. Anyone have an idea of what white should play? Okay, yes, to free up the knight. So white wants to move this knight on f3 out of the way so that he can get his f-pawn in motion. The problem is, what he'd like to do is go to the d4 square. So for instance, white could play a move like knight d4 here. And after takes, I think white just has a very good position because this knight on e4 is suddenly insecure. It's about to get kicked by f3. Black is left with a backward c-pawn, while white has a nice, healthy pawn majority. This would be really bad for black. But unfortunately for white, this doesn't really work because the e5 pawn needed protection. Here, black can simply scoop it up. So that's not something that white wants. And as a result, the move bishop f4 is quite clever. He wants to play the move knight d4 next, at which point he will have achieved this knight d4, but he will not be hanging the e5 pawn. So that was Ray's point. After I didn't know this move, so I castled. I was out of theory at this point, but it was hard for me to imagine castle being a mistake. And then white played knight d4. And here, it's not quite as effective after knight takes d4 as it would be if the bishop were farther away, because it's now the bishop is in the way of the f-pawn, but it's still pretty annoying. So for example here, if I were to play, let's say a nothing move, I don't know, a5. Here I think white will very quickly start crushing me, because he'll first play f3, kicking my knight away. Then he'll exchange off this knight, and then he gets f4 through, and then he gets f5 through. And as we're seeing, this 4-pawn majority against 3 that white has on the king side is really getting in motion very quickly, while black's 4-on-3 on the queen side is incredibly ineffective due to this backward c-pawn. This looks like an absolute disaster for black, and I want no part of it. So I had some thought about what to do, and ultimately what I came up with was, I think, a pretty interesting idea. So I did indeed take the knight, but what I did not want was to allow white to play f3, forcing knight g5, and then take my knight and get f4 and f5 through. So I found a way to make some counterplay reasonably quickly. Let's see if anybody in the chat can figure out how to deal with this position for black, because I think I found a pretty good move. Okay, so g5 to g4 has been suggested. That is a little too psychotic for me, because after g5, bishop e3, g4, this king is going to be very open, and white can still play f3 anyway, so I wouldn't think that's going to work very well. Someone has suggested c5. Now, this is a very reasonable try, but I also don't think it's quite sufficient. After something like f3, You can play c4 when at least now black has gotten his pawn majority in motion too, but here, actually, after h4, I think the knight is just trapped. So in addition to the sort of strategic play for white of playing bishop takes g5, there's also this h4 move where the knight gets trapped. So I actually think after c5, black is just losing material. Maybe he can try c takes d4 here when he gives up a piece, but he has a pretty menacing pair of central pawns, but I have a pretty hard time believing that he has enough. So let's see if anyone else has a thought of what black should play. Yes, someone has suggested f6. Now, this is a good move for a few reasons. One is it's challenging white's space advantage in the center, and two is it's opening up the rook, and three, which we'll see, is if white were to play f3, now instead of coming back to g5, which here might not even be so bad, I'm actually going to take this pawn, so that way after bishop takes e5, my knight can come back to either f6 or d6, where it's not going to be in any danger of getting trapped. And indeed, that's sort of how the game proceeded. White, instead of f3, played knight b2, and after takes, of course, white would like to take on e4, winning a piece, because I can't take back on account of bishop e6, but of course, instead of taking the bishop, instead of taking the knight, I'm going to take the bishop on f4, and here white can resign because he's just losing material. But he goes bishop takes e5. Now, I didn't know this, but there was a game previously that went knight takes d2. And after queen takes d2, black is left with the weakness on the c-file. He can play c5 to try to remove the backwards pawn, but then he's left with an isolated pawn, which is also not a cup of tea. And after even something simple like bishop d4, probably white can be more incisive than that. But this position looks extremely unpleasant. I think he's going to potentially lose the d5 pawn. Now, there was a game that went this way, where black sort of played something like queen d7 and c6 and sort of argued, look, I have exactly one weakness on c6 that I can protect pretty easily. But this feels very unpleasant because the white kingside pawn mass will eventually get in motion. It will take some time, but first f4, eventually h3, g4, f5. You get these pawns going, and black's king's going to start to feel pretty unhappy. And I didn't want any part of this. So I chose a much more combative move, and I played knight d6. So this keeps more pieces on the board, and it also has the idea of potentially playing knight to c4. So white played bishop c2. So black's main idea here is to play knight c4, which will threaten the bishop on e5 as well as the pawn on b2, and white certainly would not want to take that knight because that will straighten out black's pawn structure and clog his semi-open c-file. So should black play knight to c4 here? Let's see if anyone can figure it out. This is where calculation comes into play. You have a positional idea that you want to accomplish, knight c4, and you have to calculate precisely to see if it's possible. This is all about the Shankland method, part 1. Yeah, queen h5 is coming, and that's a massive problem. Black would love to play knight c4, but he can't. After queen h5, he's simply mated. This threat on h7 is impossible to stop. G6 does not help matters because of bishop takes g6. And if h6, queen g6, and queen h7 is hanging, queen e6 is hanging, and probably even play bishop takes g7 as well. Like, everything just falls apart. It's all just mate. So we want no part of that. So as a result, I played the move queen d7 with the idea that now I can, in theory, try to play knight c4 next move, because if white were to waste some time with a3, let's say, and I go knight c4, this queen h5 will no longer work because I can play bishop f5, which is a key defensive resource that I have due to my queen being on d7 and no longer on d8. So at this point, I was expecting white to play b3 to prevent me from playing knight to c4. And probably white's a bit better. I don't know how much. Black has various plans. He can play, for example, knight f7, trying to push white's bishop away, and then c5 when he has some counterplay. He can also play b5, b4, and try to bring the knight around to b5 and potentially c3. So it's not like black is without play, but I do think white's a little better. Instead, white played rook e1. So he is sort of ignoring my quote-unquote threat to play knight c4 by arguing that he's going to have a lot of pressure on this open e-file where I have two potentially hanging bishops, and a move like queen e2 is going to be really annoying. So here, it's quite clear that knight c4 is the move black wants to play, because that will threaten the bishop on e5, which white certainly does not want to let get taken. It will threaten the pawn on b2, and white does not want to take the knight. The question, though, is once again, can black safely get away with it when white has ideas to try to abuse the open e-file where two of black's bishops are residing and could potentially get attacked? So I'd like everyone to see if they can figure out, once again, just like last move, can black get away with playing the move knight c4 here? Someone says, no, we cannot play knight c4. Someone else says, I don't know. That's not very helpful. Two bishops sacrifice. Wow. That's an aggressive idea. So, someone is saying knight c4 does not work. I presume in his variation he wants to take and do something like this. And he's saying that the two bishop sacrifice should be made. I don't think it will be, because normally in these double bishop sacrifice, it's a closed position where there's a lot of like pawns on the e-file and stuff to prevent black's pieces from coming over. And after rook e3, the only credible threat I can see is rook g3, which I think can be prevented pretty easily with bishop d6. And I think white will run out of gas pretty quickly here. And in the meantime, black is ready to play moves like rook f6 and queen f7, and he has a lot of pieces to defend the king, while white does not really have very many pieces that can attack. So here I believe black is going to beat back the attack and probably win. So that does not necessarily mean that this move works, but I do think that it will not if it's not okay to play knight c4, the double bishop sacrifice will not be the refutation. So let's go back to this position. Can anybody see a problem with knight c4? So he's asked about queen g5 there. Okay, we can go back to that variation very briefly, but takes here, and he says queen g5, but I think this is actually just chasing my king exactly where he wants to go, to the e-file. I mean, if black could just choose what he wants to do with the king, he wants to run all the way over here. So I don't think queen g5 is very helpful. But no, I mean, this position, maybe white has some attacking chances still. I just don't really believe in them. He doesn't have enough pieces. In addition, after queen g5, I could also play king h8. When you can play something like queen h6 and you get one bishop back, but there's just no way you'll ever mate me when I have pieces this active. For instance, after rook a to e8, I'm already starting to trade stuff off, and I think black is good to go. In fact, actually here h2 is hanging, and maybe I will mate you first. So there's all sorts of problems. I don't think this is enough for white, but it's an interesting try. Going back here, let's see if anyone else. All right, well, we're going to move on. So I think knight c4 does work. Some lines have to be calculated, but it should work. So after knight c4, If white tries to take material, there's a few things he can do. First, he could try bishop takes c7, pointing out that the e6 bishop is now loose, but black has a nice move bishop g4 with a gain of tempo, hitting white's queen, and then is ready to take here next. And if f3 after bishop takes f3, black is much better. So that doesn't work for white. And if queen e2, black has lots of counterattacking options, with the simplest probably being bishop to b4. And there's no real good discoveries with the bishop, and the rook on e1 is loose, so that should be fine. And now, after knight c4, it seems like that doesn't work, but Ray actually had a funny idea, which he played pretty quickly, which was knight f3. Now, his point with this move is he's sort of defended against both threats. I don't really want to take on e5 because his knight will be just as good there as a bishop was, and once again, after queen d6, queen h5 is coming, and now I've lost the ability to play bishop f5, and I'll probably just get mated after like h6 and queen g6. This looks like the end of the world. So knight e5 doesn't work. And if knight b2 after queen b1, white will take the h7 pawn, and that's probably also going to be the end of the world. So at this point, white has allowed knight c4, but he has sort of stopped both the key threats of knight takes e5 and of knight takes e5 and knight takes b2. Let me just go back for one moment because one guy asked about bishop e4 and d5, which is actually also a very decent try. If white plays bishop e4, I think black can happily play rook a to e8, challenging the e file, and after d5, either bishop f5 or bishop f7, and I don't think black's position is particularly bad. I think he's absolutely fine. His pieces are all good, and he's got no major weaknesses. So instead, after rook e1, knight c4, knight f3 was played, which was a mistake because now black is probably better, but it's still messy. So we've already established that knight takes e5 and knight takes b2, both of which are the moves that knight c4 sort of quote-unquote threatened, are not very effective anymore. But black has a very strong move here that causes white a lot of difficulties. Let's see if anybody can figure out what it is. Yes, bishop g4, absolutely correct. Black challenges this knight on f3, and if he can ruin white's pawn structure, he's going to be doing really well. So if white, for example, were to be foolish enough to play b3 to attack the knight, black will in between move, go takes, and now knight takes e5. Now white can no longer take with the knight on e5, and his pawn structure is ruined, and black is basically winning. If rook e5 after bishop d6, queen h3 is going to show up very quickly. And if d takes e5, white's pawn mass is pretty firmly blockaded after like queen e6. I don't think his kingside. It's now 4-on-2 on both sides, and white's kingside pawn mass is going absolutely nowhere. In fact, black can even try to attack the kingside with moves like rook f4 and rook f8. Meanwhile, black should get c5, c4 very quickly. So this, I think, should be quite fine. And then that should be good. But white is going to be a bit more resilient. So what he needs to do is get out of this pin with a gain of tempo, and he has two ways to do so. He can play queen d3 as he played in the game, or he can play queen b1. Now, queen b1 was the best move when white is counterattacking the pawn on h7, and there get to be some very ridiculous variations very, very quickly. In the game, my intention was to take on f3, which is not the best move, but it's fine. And after bishop takes h7 check, king h8, g takes f3, I was going to play rook takes f3. And this position is probably pretty balanced. Neither king is in that much danger, but neither king is particularly safe either. And it's important to note that if white tries to immediately swing the queen to the h-file with a gain of tempo with something like queen g6, or even if you were to play more energetically with something like takes, queen g6 check, and then try for queen h6 or queen h5. This was one of the points of rook f3, is I'm ready to play rook h3, and here white is just lost. So that doesn't work, but white could play queen g6 as well, or he could play bishop back to g3. It's just a very complicated position. Neither king is in a ton of trouble, but neither king will ever find a permanently safe home, and both sides have their chances. But was probably even a bit stronger to play g6 to blunt this diagonal. Of course, I was concerned about bishop takes g6 because I cannot take back. But here we actually see that black's point is that if you look at after bishop f3, he's losing his h7 pawn. Well, he's actually happier to lose the g7 pawn because here, let's say instead of taking the bishop, black were to play bishop f6. Now h takes g6 is an honest to goodness threat because white will not have nearly enough material to mate, and the black queen can come back to g7. And following something like bishop d3 and now bishop takes f3, I think that white's king is probably going to be more open than black's, and black has chances to counterattack. If gf3, there is knight d2, and let's say queen d1 and bishop takes e5, and white has to take the knight because of the threat of knight takes f3. And after something like bishop f4, I prefer black's position here. I think his king is safer and his bishop is better, but still there's a lot of fight left to be had. So this is just some very, very complicated variations. And then that's oh, okay, so my Skype didn't quit and someone saw a message on my Skype. Oh well, that's too bad. How deeply unprofessional, what can I say? So instead of all this though, Ray played the move queen d3, and I think this was basically a game-losing mistake because black has a very strong move here, and actually quite a simple one. Let's see. Who wants to play what now? So bishop f5 has been suggested. There's only so many moves you can consider. And bishop f5, I think what happened was Ray just automatically played the move bishop f5 for me because it feels so natural. White has just geared up all this pressure down on the h7 pawn, and I can, in one move, with a gain of tempo, kick it away. And here I think after queen c3, white is just better. He's ready to play b3 next move to kick my knight away, and I don't want to take on e5. By playing bishop f5, I have alleviated all pressure on the f3 knight so that I can never take on e5 with the knight, and I think white is just better. My guess is what happened was when Ray played queen d3, he just immediately assumed I was going to play bishop f5 because it's an incredibly natural move, but in fact it's not best. Instead, black should simply play g6. And all of a sudden, I have stopped the threat of queen h7. Now, it didn't do it in the fastest way because I didn't gain a tempo, but in fact, with the bishop still on g4, now black has massive threats. Bishop takes f3 is once again coming very, very soon. And what can white do about it? There's almost nothing to be done. This knight can't even move. There's no squares. If it goes, these squares, h4 and g5 are hanging, and if knight d2, black has plenty of good moves, but probably the simplest is bishop b4, which just wins an exchange on the spot. So bishop takes f3 will shatter white's kingside pawn structure, and he actually cannot do a darn thing about it. If he tries to defend with bishop d1, I'll go knight takes b2, and then I'll even take his bishop on d1 as well before shattering his structure. So actually, after g6, when black simply left his bishop on g4 to cause problems for white and stop the primitive threat of mate on h7, I think... Okay, 1 second. I need to kill Skype. Why that showed up. Okay, back to me, so that you can't see my screen while I kill Skype, because that should not be happening. I forgot to turn it off. Skype, what do I log out? Okay, so now let's go back to sharing screen. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Deeply unprofessional. And yes, I did get a haircut yesterday because it was way too long. I was very hesitant to do so because I don't speak such good Spanish and I haven't been in an English-speaking country for some time. ever since basically the U.S. Championship. Yeah. Anyhow, I got a haircut yesterday, and luckily I managed to communicate with the barber decently enough. In any case, here, Ray played the move b3, attacking my knight. And here we see sort of a shortcoming of the queen being on d3 as opposed to b1. It will, after bishop takes f3, white would love to take this knight back, and then have my bishop move away somewhere, and then after something like c5 or cd5, white is at least fine. But because the queen is on d3, he's losing a tempo after d takes c4. He'd love to take my bishop, but he can't. And after queen e3, bishop d5, black is now a pawn to the good. He's closed down the c-file, and all he has to do is really consolidate to win this game. Still, though, because he has played the move g6, and white's bishops are pointed pretty menacingly at his king, there's a lot of work to do. So white plays queen g3. What is white's threat with this move? Yes, bishop takes g6 is a massive threat. What should black do about it? Yes, bishop takes g6 is coming. So what should black play? Taking c7 is not so important. Yes, bishop f6 is the best move. This challenges white's strong bishop on e5 and also opens the 7th rank for the black queen to come to defend. Now, white through h4. So at this point, white's play is pretty straightforward. He's down a pawn, and strategically he's losing. But he has at least dreams and hopes of opening up black's king, because if he manages to get the move h5 through, and black's king becomes open, then all bets are off. White will have serious attacking chances, which may or may not succeed. It's not like he's just winning or anything. It's just going to be a complicated position where both sides have chances. Black really wants to prevent the move h5. How should he do that? Yes, queen g7 is the best move. This gets the queen to her best position and stops h5. If white were to play h5 anyway, after g takes h5, now white has to start worrying about his own king, because there's like threats on the g-file. So white played rook e3 with the intention of doubling on the e-file. So I played c6 to keep everything solid, rook a e1, and now black has one more good move that sort of consolidates his advantage and basically just wins the game. I'd like to see if anyone wants to try to find it. Rook a8 has been suggested. That's a good move. It's not the best one. Bishop takes e5. So this is an interesting idea because black clearly wants to exchange off white's strong bishop. But the problem with bishop e5 is now after rook takes e5, I don't think you can stop h5, which is kind of a problem. h5 is coming next move, and I just don't see a way to stop it. You're right that you want to trade these bishops, but you have to do it on better terms. King h8 has been suggested. That's also decent, but black has a better move. You definitely want these bishops off the board, but there's a better way to do it. h5 will hang the g6 pawn. Let's not do that. One of the best things to do when you're getting attacked, yeah, someone's got it, queen h6. This takes the fight to white. Now, the move queen h6, first of all, just very basic before anything else, it has prevented h5 because that pawn will simply be taken. But secondly, black now has a completely colossal threat to play bishop takes h4 and ask a very valid question, who is mating who? And in fact, it will be blackmating white, and it won't even be close. It will just immediately end the game. So the threat of bishop takes h4 is absolutely devastating. And there's the only thing that white can really do about it is take on f6. But his problem now is that after rook takes f6, the bishops have been exchanged on black's terms, which means that his rook has come to f6, clearing the f8 square for his other rook. His queen is on h6, making h5 harder to achieve. And furthermore, black is ready to play the move queen f4. If he plays queen f4, one of two things will happen. Either the queens will trade, white's attack will be over, and the pawns will win, or the black queen will become the boss of the board, controlling the entire center and the king side, saving black's king and attacking white's. So, like, I don't know, maybe white can try f3 just to, like, prevent the queen exchange, but this looks completely hopeless after rook a f8. I don't think black's king is in any more danger than white's. Like, if white ever tries to play h5 and black just takes it and plays rook g6, I think black will be the one attacking. I guess rook g6 he can't do, but he can play king h8, rook g8. So this, I think, is just bad for white. After rook takes f6, really queen f4 is just coming, and there's basically nothing to be done about it. So this is, incidentally, this is also why I played the move c7 to c6 on the previous move, because I wanted to do this prior, but didn't want to run into queen e5 with both the bishop and rook hanging. Now that queen e5 could be comfortably met by queen f4 or queen takes h4 or something, black is just winning. The last thing I had to do was try to avoid any perpetuals here. Ray tried to harass my king a bit, but I think I found a nice solution. So queen c1 check. Now, if white were to be foolish enough to play king h2, I can play queen f4 check, and once the queens come off, there's nothing further to discuss. But he played this nice move, bishop d1, with the point that if I take the bishop after king h2, he has this big threat of queen e7 mate that's not so easy to deal with. If rook e6 after takes, and queen c7, without my queen being able to help, I was very unsure I could get out of these checks, especially considering, like, I saw one of my key routes was this, I mean, eventually when the queen is sidelined, to bring the king to d7 and up to d5. The problem is whenever the king comes to d6 and white plays queen b8 check, you can't go to d5 because queen e5 will be mate. This I thought might be perpetual. Similarly, bishop e6, rook f8 check. I thought this was probably a perpetual too. As it turns out, rook e6, black could get away, but only with some weird computer moves. But instead, I found this nice idea. So I did play queen c1 check, but after bishop d1, I played this funny move, king g7, instead of taking the bishop. And my point was that I really need my queen on this diagonal so that my king can safely hide on h6 and not be harassed by checks. For example, if white plays rook e7 check after bishop f7, he's just done. All I have to do to win this game is play queen f4. If I do that, it's over. Of course, previous move, I couldn't do it because of queen e7 mate. Now that I've played king g7, I have the strategic threat to play queen f4 when white just loses. So he tried queen e7 check. Now, of course, I will not play bishop f7, queen f8 mate. Notifications. But after rook f7, queen e5 check, king h6, here we see the point of not taking the bishop. If I had taken the bishop, then white would have queen e3 check with a draw. But as is, he has nowhere to go with the queen, and my king is totally safe, and he cannot prevent me from playing queen f4 next move. So he played queen e1, and after queen f4, g4, I just had to make one more accurate move. If white is allowed to play rook g8 next, then g5 mate will be a serious threat. It's probably still winning for black, but there's no reason to allow him that. And if he played rook g8 here, I have queen takes f2 with simplifications because he can't take my rook on account of his own rook hanging. But so he played g4, presumably with the idea to play rook g8 and then g5 mate. But I just stuck my king on g7 where it's nice and safe. White has no checks whatsoever. Black's queen is the boss of the board. I think white's king is more open than black's. And in fact, after g5, I just played c3. He cannot take my pawn because of queen f2 mate. I have a very basic threat to play c2, bishop c2, queen g4, and white's mated. And it's actually really hard to do anything about it because, like, if he tries to bring the rook back to defend, now with the rook on e3, he's no longer getting to e5, so I can play queen takes h4 without being mated by queen e5. And now queen h1 is coming in, queen g5 is coming in, and it's all over. So after c3, white played queen e5 check, but of course the endgame is completely hopeless because the c-pawn just wins on the spot. So I was quite happy to have won this game. And I think unless anyone has any questions or anything about it, I'd like to move on to the next one. All right, well, we're going to move on to the next game. So let me Where is this? Not that one. Stop sharing. So let me now choose a different game to share. All right, so now you guys should be seeing opening position again. Is that correct? Okay, so I'd like to show the last game I played at the U.S. Championship, which was the one that won me the tournament. Going into this game, I was a half point ahead of Fabiano Caruana, who was on very good form. And he was playing against Alex Onestruk, who's a very strong player, but was not on very good form and was in last by, I think, a full point. So I figured that Onestruk was just not playing very well this tournament, well below his normal strong play. So I thought pretty likely I'm going to win this game to avoid a playoff. I mean, if I were to go into a playoff against Fabiano, I don't think my chances would be nearly as bad as most people seem to think. Most people thought I had no chance. Well, I think that's nonsense. It's rapid chess, and I'm pretty strong. Anything can happen, but I would definitely be an underdog. So I wanted to win the tournament outright. And I was playing a Wonder Liang, who's the youngest player in the field at 15 years old. And I had to be ready. So I chose to play a pretty strategic line just because when an old man like me plays a young kid like him, you always try to keep games strategic. So I opened with e4. He played the Caro-Kann. And instead of my normal e5, which I've played like every other game for the past 5 years, including right after this tournament as well, I went for the exchange variation, bishop d3, knight c6, c3, knight f6, bishop f4. And this is one of the very typical starts to the Caro-Kann. Bishop g4, queen b3. And now the two main moves are queen d7 and queen c8. I've played queen c8 once myself, actually, against Julio Becerra in the U.S. Chess League, and I thought black is sort of okay. It's pretty much fine, but it's definitely very strategic, and you have to sort of know and understand the nuances. And since Wonder wasn't much of a Caro-Kann player, at least not until recently, I was hoping to hopefully understand the positions better, and I had a pretty good sense of where to put my pieces and stuff like that. Wonder chose a very direct move here, which had been completely unheard of for the longest time. So, you know, for the really ancient beings who want to think only about old time games, they were traumatized by such a move. But it's actually probably one of the best moves. Black went ahead and threw e5 at me, which is funny. I'm attacking a pawn, then he just sort of hangs another one. But it actually is a pretty good move because I don't have a great way to take. If I take with the bishop on e5, he plays queen e7, pinning my bishop, ready to take it, and he will castle long next, and all of a sudden black has a big attack. And if I take with the pawn on e5 after knight h5, my bishop has to move away somewhere. And after knight takes e5, my pieces are a little weirdly placed. Yeah, black has an isolated pawn, but it's not the end of the world by any stretch. And I think this is just a pretty normal Tarrasch French. Maybe white has chances for a slight edge, I'm not sure. But I came ready for this move. I had a feeling it might come, and it's sort of a new trendy thing. And I played h3, which I do think is, I'm not sure if it's objectively the best move. Maybe de5 is stronger, like in an absolute sense, but I think it's by far the most practically challenging for black to face. My point is simple. He's threatening my bishop, so I counterattack his. But if he moves his bishop away somewhere, I don't know, like bishop d7, let's say, and I take on e5, now after knight h5, my bishop has the h2 square, so he will not get this pawn back on e5. And all of a sudden, black is basically just a pawn down, and his knight on h5, his sideline could get trapped. So this is bad news. I think even bishop takes e5 is pretty good here, too. It's all just not good for black. So after h3, black has to take my bishop, and then I will take his bishop, and I'll have a better structure and an open h-file. Now, the only way for black to maintain a tenable position here is another move that just doesn't capture anything and ignores threats with knight a5. This threatens my queen, and after queen c2, here we see the point. After takes, black is in time to actually gobble this pawn on g4. If you compare that to the game continuation, where he took on f4 directly, after hg, if black were to take on g4, white will take on b7, and here white's clearly better. But by playing knight a5, queen c2, and then ef, and now knight takes g4, Here, black is actually able to take the pawn. Still, white has huge compensation. Black's pieces are a bit scattered and loose and could become vulnerable to tactics. My h-file has opened up right away. The black king is nowhere particularly safe to go. And I can take the pawn back immediately if I want. So one variation that my coach suggested was queen e2 check. Now, I'm threatening his knight as well as his king, so he must play queen e7 not to lose a piece, and now knight h3 to attack this pawn. Windows Defender. Why do I get so many notifications? They never come. It's only when I'm broadcasting. So, go away. So after f3, queen takes. White can either play g takes f3 or g3 to follow up with knight d2 and knight takes f3 to win his pawn back. Probably he's slightly better in the endgame, but I had a more ambitious goal. I was going to play king f1. Well, now I'm honest to goodness threatening queen e2 check, which will win material. And I think the only move for black to sort of equalize is h5, which is very tough. For example, if black plays bishop e7, which feels like a very natural move, it stops queen e2 check, it's developing a new piece. And he doesn't particularly care about a move like rook takes h7, rook takes h7, bishop h7, because after, well, here at g6, I have bishop takes g6, but my bishop is sidelined, and here black is probably okay. But I have a very strong move. Instead of taking with the bishop, I'm going to play bishop b5 check, and a queen on h7 he probably will care about. In any case, that's not here nor there, because Owander took on f4 directly. And now I knew it was just better. So check. Remember perfectly analysis, but after I'm pretty sure I was pretty sure the king f1 was the best move. That is. In particular, these pawns are doing a very good job of restricting some of black's pieces. Black's bishop doesn't have a great home. The knight doesn't have anywhere good to go. And white's rook is open, and his other rook can come to e1 with a gain of tempo. Now, black's best move here, which was a very difficult move, was g5. Now, this looks insane because it sort of gives me the f5 square to land my bishop on with a gain of tempo, and he never threatens to take on g4. But the point is he wants to very quickly throw h5 at me to open the position on the king side and not let me get g5 through. And here, I believe black is worse, but the game goes on. Instead, he played g6, which is a very natural move, and it's the one I was expecting during the game, but here white's just better. So I didn't want to play g5 because of knight e4. So I first played rook e1 with a gain of tempo to kick... you can't see the board anymore? Can people not see the board? It should be working. All right. Well, it looks to me like the board should be visible, so I'm not sure. But no, not that one. This one here. So after rook e1, queen c7, now I played g5. And so here, before the game, I already knew that white's main plan in this position is to play knight f3 and try to fight for control of this square e5, usually by playing bishop b5 to get rid of the knight on c6. But I found a good idea, which is that my problem with knight f3 was he could play h6 and open the h-file, and I didn't really want to allow any counterplay. So even though the knight on h5 looks like it's sort of sidelined, I thought it was worth a tempo to play bishop e2, force the knight to g7, and now play knight f3 so that he cannot get h5 in. And here I was very confident in my position. I thought that white just seemed better. It was hard for black to find good squares for his pieces while mine were fully developed. And I knew that my plan should now be that now that I've kicked the knight away, I'll play bishop b5 next, and then try to fight for the e5 square for my knight, which will be really well placed and can't get kicked away by f6 because the g5 pawn supports it. So here my opponent played knight e6. And I had a little bit of a think here, but I played bishop b5. So I noticed that if he plays bishop e7, he's winning my pawn on g5, but I was ready for it. So I wanted to play queen a4 to put more pressure on the knight on c6. And if he plays knight takes g5, I can go bishop c6, bc, and now knight e5. When black has a very hard time defending the pawn on c6. He can play rook d6, but then this sort of goes back to Shankland method part 2. You have a key idea. You want to take the c6 pawn. Your opponent has stopped you by defending it. First question you should ask yourself, what happens if I do it anyway? And indeed, knight takes c6 is very strong because black's pieces are overworked with the bishop on e7 hanging. And white's queenside pawn mass looks much more menacing than black's kingside one, plus black's king is a bit open. This wasn't even the best move. I think c4 was even stronger when black's king is really going to experience some difficulties very soon. But it was good enough for me. With the threat of bishop takes c6 followed by knight e5 coming, a wonder understandably played bishop g7 to keep my knight off of e5. But I was very happy to see this move because now this bishop on g7 is a really sad piece. And now all I had to do to sort of get a very good position, I'm sure people have heard of this phrase, one bad piece makes a bad position. And now the problem with white's position, the reason black is not completely crushed right now, is that my knight on d2 is not very good. All of my other pieces are very well placed. So I found a good way to improve my knight. I started with the move queen a4. First of all, this lends added pressure. So if I were to take on c6 next move, black would have to take with the b pawn, which he really would not want to do. So my opponent played rook d6, which was very understandable because he wants to defend the knight. And now if I take it, he can take with the rook without compromising his pawn structure since queen a7 fails to rook a6. But here we saw the other point I had with queen b3, which was to improve my knight with knight b3. I have two routes for my knight. The one I was actually thinking most about during the game was knight c1 to d3, when my knight suddenly becomes a really good piece. But I guess my opponent was more worried about knight c5 because he played b6. Now this does stop knight c5, but it leaves black with a ton of weaknesses. And now white had a lot of good moves, but I chose the simple one, just improve my knight and bring it to d3. Now, the problem is all of white's pieces are better than their black counterparts. The bishop on g7 is really bad. The rook on h8 is stuck defending the pawn on h7. Both of black's knights are thoroughly dominated and can't go anywhere. And white is ready to play knight d3 next, and all of his pieces are like sort of picture perfect. So black played knight b8. His plan with this move is to play king b7 and a6 to get his pawns back on light squares and try to lessen the power of this bishop. But I was ready for it. I went knight d3 and knight b4. This prevents black from playing a6. Now, if you were to play a5, I'd have to sort of admit to the loss of 2 tempi with knight d3. But I think some idiot recently said something about pawns not moving backwards. And here that's definitely the case. Pawns do not move backwards, and the pawn on a5 will never be able to go back to a7 or a6. That means this bishop stays here for the rest of the game, dominating this knight. And furthermore, now that black has played a5, what is a very easy, it'll take a little while, but a very easy plan of playing b4 to open up black's king. So my opponent played queen d8 looking for counterplay. And now I found another really nice move, which sort of, I mean, I was very confident up to this point, but after this point, after this move, I really thought I'm going to win the US championship. So let's see if anyone can figure out what that move is. As for the idiot, no, that was me. I wrote it in my book. Rook e6, that's a feisty move, and I don't see any reason to give this exchange. Knight e5 has been called, and this is the best move. Now, it's a very hard move to play because this knight was a really good piece, but it also abandons the defense of the g5 pawn, and more importantly, it allows black to trade off this awful bishop on g7 for an awesome knight. But this is where concrete calculation comes into play. If black takes on e5, he's very happy to make this trade, but he's also not very happy that all of a sudden his rook is trapped. It has nowhere to go. If rook c6 or rook d7, he's simply losing material. So this just wins. It's important to calculate one line, but it's pretty straightforward. Knight c5. If I have to play queen d1 after he gets rook e6, and probably white's still close to winning because he takes the d5 pawn, but it's not nearly as clean as it could be. The simplest solution is to just follow the checks and captures with ed6, back to basics, checks and captures. Always keep track of material. Right now, white is down a queen for a rook, but after rook e7 check, massive problems are coming. If black takes the rook, now material is equal, but white has massive threats of taking the knight and promoting, both of which will gain serious material. If black moves the king, if king c8, rook c7 forces something similar, after takes, material is now equal to black has 2 hanging knights. And if king a8, I can go knight c6, threatening mate on a7, and after takes, rook b7 check, black is mated following d7, or king a8, rook takes b6. So knight e5 had to be calculated, but as it turns out, it just works. Knight takes g5 to defend f7 also fails, because after knight ec6, white has a small number of threats with moves like these coming in, and black is going to lose a gross amount of material. So that won't work for black either. In the game, he played queen back to c7, but then following one last accurate move, queen b3, it's all over. I don't really feel like showing the rest, both because we're running out of time and because I don't think it's necessary. Right now, black's problem is that this pawn on d5 is hanging, and he simply cannot save it. If he takes on e5, I'll take with the rook, defending this pawn, winning another attacker here, and the d5 pawn simply falls, and that will be the end of the world. But there's no other way to bring another piece to defend. If queen back to d8, knight f7 wins the house, and if rook h d8 as he played, white will be able to take on h7, which is what happened in the game. And now, in addition to all of black's other massive problems, he's just a clean pawn down. He cannot take on g5 because the bishop is hanging. He cannot take on e5 because, once again, the rook will get trapped. So here, with a strategically hopeless position, and or black having a strategically hopeless position as well as a clean pawn down, I don't think there's too much need to look through the rest. It was pretty basic technical stuff. In any case, I was very happy with this final round game. It may well have been my best game of the tournament, but this was the one that won me the US Championship. And so I'm going to just stop sharing this one and show you my ugly face once again. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming and interacting in the lecture. Anyone who's seen the DVD series I do here with iChess knows that I don't really believe in passive learning. I believe you'll not become a better chess player if you just sort of plug in and watch. You have to interact with the material. And I was glad to see that a wide range of people were coming and giving suggestions in the chat, suggesting moves. I saw some good moves, some bad moves. Good moves, congrats. Bad moves, hope you learn from them. So I'm very happy to see that. Before we call it quits, I would like to once again give the link to my whole huge Shankland bundle that they're selling at a steep discount for, I think, just 99 bucks. So this one should work. If you click that, it should probably get you to the Shankland collection. And you're definitely going to want to buy that because, well, you'll, among other things, you'll be supporting local American business, and I get a cut of that. So in any case, thanks very, very much to everybody for watching. And hopefully I will see you all again for another webinar sometime in the future. And good job, everybody. Have a good day.